Good afternoon and welcome to this doctoral defense. Today we will publicly examine Lauri Snellman's doctoral thesis, The Problem of Evil and the Problem of Intelligibility, the grammatical metacritique of the problem of evil. The opponent on the screen will be Professor Oliver Wiertz, and he is from Philosophische Theologische Hochschule St. Georgen, Frankfurt, Germany. Just a couple of safety rules before we actually start the event. So everybody knows we'll keep the safe distances. Everybody knows we'll use the hand sanitizers. And also, according to the new update of the University of Helsinki mask recommendation, everybody is very strongly requested to wear one of these masks. As I can see, everybody is actually doing already. So thank you so much. And perhaps most importantly, if you have any symptoms whatsoever, then you're not allowed to participate in this event. Please also leave your contact information for the organizers. There are sheets of paper for that purpose outside, and also you can do it online. As the custos appointed by the Faculty of Theology, I declare this public examination of Lauri Snellman's thesis open.
Okay, thank you.
And Oliver, you can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent, good.
Okay,
Thanks.
so now I'll talk a bit about my thesis, the problem of evil and the problem of intelligibility. I just highlight some of the themes. I've had four kind of main research questions about what's the general logic of the problem of evil. There has been a lot of discussion about a more general problem of evil than simply the question that does God exist if there's evil. The problem is a lot more kind of general, and it's also an existential question, whether there's meaning in the world. Then I'm developing some grammatical tools in philosophy, philosophical grammar, going back to Wittgenstein. I also introduced Johann Georg Hamann and use also the logical tools developed by people like, say, for example, Charles Sanders Peirce and Jarkko Hintikka. Then I developed a kind of meta-critique of the presuppositions of the problem of evil, because they just go back to Plato again. And then I just kind of try to use the machinery I have developed into analyzing different kinds of worldview questions, about questions of different kinds of meanings in science, meanings in art, meanings in the social world, also meanings in religion, and so on. So the problem of evil, the problem of intelligibility is quite big. It kind of concerns the interface between cognition and the world. First is how is thinking itself possible. Then the second one is how can we actually reason about the world and how can we use concepts about it. And the third is that does the world itself have some kind of rational order? So Susan Neumann has investigated the problem of evil and in modern thought. So the question is that if there's no justice or meaning in the world, then the grounds for human action and the meaning of life collapse. And Neumann even reads modern philosophy as a series of attempts to solve the problem of evil. And it kind of is at the interface of theoretical philosophy, questions about the nature of reality, nature of knowledge, and so on, questions about ethics, what is right, what is wrong, and also questions about religion. And there are two kinds of basic answers. One is to make evil intelligible in terms of some kind of reasons or purposes in the world. And the second one is to deny these. And it's one of these kind of big unstated questions in modern thought. And what's the problem concerns, there are two kinds of paradigm cases. First was the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, and second was the Nazi Holocaust. And these were kind of important because they were anomalies in say, Thomas Kuhn's sense. They are something kind of what you can't make sense of in your conceptual scheme, because before the Lisbon earthquake, everybody had simply thought that you can somehow read God's purposes quite straightforwardly from the world. And the Holocaust happened against a background of faking progress. So these were kind of events that you can't fit into your ways of dealing with the world and into your kind of schemes for explaining and understanding and interpreting it. And when something really bad happens, it can simply make the whole practice of pursuing the good completely pointless, and this then kind of leads to a kind of collapse of meaning in the world and the question of how can I cope, simply how can I cope? And then there are four kinds of main presuppositions in the problem. The first is central is principle of sufficient reason. Everything has a sufficient reason, everything has a purpose, or even that being itself and its nature can be reduced to some conceptual system of explanations. And the second is appearances versus reality. It seems that there's a lot of chaos in the world, but there might not be so. So there has to be some kind of distinction between how things seem and how they are. And the third one is the fact-meaning gap, that modern facts have been defined as something that are kind of loose and separate. The fact that, say, there's a book on the table, or that the door is open, they are kind of understood separately from each other. So there's the question that how do these kind of facts fit into a logically ordered world? And the third is the fact and value gap that David Hume, for example, brought up, that you can distinguish how things should be and how they are. We shouldn't be having a coronavirus epidemic right now, but we are. So these are kind of main questions, and there's some kind of general argument and generalization of the atheist argument from evil. That is the kind of one of the key condensations of how this problem works, that in order to act, you have to have some kind of moral sources or something that empowers your moral activities, and you have to also be in contact with some kind of order in the world. And the assumption of how this problem goes, that you have to have some kind of fundamental principle that unifies the facts of the world with some kind of order that gives them meaning and also gives the moral meaning in terms of sufficient reasons. But then evil somehow undermines or threatens this. So you could simply just assume that God kind of acts as a kind of guarantee or middleman for the existence of reasons and order and moral reason in the world, and then note that evil kind of threatens. So now this is the kind of general logic in the problem of evil. So there are ways of calling this into question. There are so-called anti-theodicies around today. So anti-theodicy is a kind of rejection of this practice of giving reasons. If there are two kinds of, basically, one is to claim that it is fundamentally immoral to give reasons. And the second one is that the conceptual assumptions behind the whole questions, behind the whole problem of evil is somehow confused. And I'm taking the second one, very strongly taking the second route here. And I've argued about this with Toby Beatonson. And I think that if you don't, that if you simply just condemn these practices of issuing reasons morally, then you just have to assume that there are no reasons in the first place, and that kind of leaves the whole questions still open. So, and in any case, the problem of evil concerns the links between religion, metaphysics, and ethics, and in order to kind of give critiques of the problem of evil, you have to kind of account how these things are interrelated. How does, for example, a moral critique of metaphysics work? Or how does kind of metaphysics, how do metaphysics and religion relate, and so on, in order to get to the bottom of this issue. And I just claim that only conceptual anti-theodicies can work, and moral ones, if already presuppose conceptual ones. Then I have three types of anti-theodicies going to Immanuel Kant, William James, and Johann Georg Hamann. Kant kind of criticizes theodicy as speculative metaphysics. James offers a kind of pragmatic view of religion and claims that this kind of just world thinking or static world thinking can't fit into a kind of pragmatic focus on moral action, and Hamannian views claim that it's based on conceptual confusion about metaphysical and religious and moral concepts, and also on dualistic thought. So I'm just then developing a method of philosophical grammar, basically of accounting of language use, locating concepts in language, also charting the kind of interface of the world and concepts in different kinds of practices, in order to get this kind of, in order to kind of clarify these kind of very, very, very big metaphysical problems that are going on around here. So I developed two kind of arguments about facts and meanings, but the basic idea is that in order to identify something, you just have to see it as something, but this is already in a way interpretative, or it sets facts into some kind of practice of interpretation that already interprets them. Otherwise, you can't kind of identify objects. And this is kind of an argument that resembles, for example, Kant's famous deductions and so on. But there's also a more kind of objective version of the argument that in order to kind of identify objects at all, you have to kind of locate them in causal streams. You have to locate people in social relationships. You identify God by telling stories and so on. That kind of gives kind of a systemic logic to things and systemic logic to facts about these things. So things and facts are already embedded in systemic logics that make them intelligible. So this is a kind of a more objective side. It could be called maybe Hamannian or Peircean side of the argument. So there's something wrong with this kind of fact-meaning dualism. And it's a kind of grammatical principle of being pure being that facts and meanings are intertwined. Here's, for example, a duck rabbit head. You have to interpret it in order to get something out of it. Same too of this bubble chamber experiment. You have to kind of put these tracks into the kind of systemic, the kind of context offered by modern physics, and there have to be natural laws and stuff like that to kind of really connect them in order for actually make sense of the whole picture and to identify particles and so on. So there's a kind of no strong opposition of facts and meanings. And then there's the principle of sufficient reason. That's another main presupposition, that it's really a kind of a set of family resemblance principles that every fact has an explanation, everything has a purpose, being is reason, and so on. So the kind of problem is that it's somehow it's systematically ambiguous, and you have to have some kind of backgrounds for determining what counts as a reason. And in order to have these kind of backgrounds, you have to kind of appeal to these practices or games of sense making, and you have to appeal also to their kind of backgrounds. So reasons are assessed in language games. There's also a technical points of different kinds of language games, of pointing objects, or games for the concept of being, and games for the concept of explanation, and kind of pointing things outcomes first, so you can't kind of identify these two concepts. There are also kind of many kinds of different types of reasons: logical reasons, causal reasons, moral reasons, and it's not possible to run them together. But the kind of idea of simply just assimilating these three as in the kind of general argument from evil and so on in the logic of theodicy, it presupposes kind of a ground unification. And then also you just can't identify reality and reason in a very straightforward manner, because always we are responding to a reality that is already there. So there's no kind of unification, for example. And in order to use these kind of principles of sufficient reasons in different concepts, you have to have a background. For example, in science, you have to have some kind of methodology that tells you what counts as an explanation, and that then, of course, needs a background theory, it needs mathematics, logic, stuff like that. And in religion, there are these kind of, for example, first cause arguments. They work well with an Aristotelian view of causation, for example. They kind of presuppose a metaphor of how God and the world relate. And they also kind of presuppose ways of seeing the world as a creation, so that they just don't end up hanging in the air. So then there are also kind of, the last thing, I'm running out of time now, so there's also the kind of virtue ethics and the questions of religion, that virtue ethics works on this kind of concept that there's man who he is, and there's a good human life, and virtues are a way of reaching the good human life. And virtues kind of function also in practices, kind of cooperative forms of acting for pursuing goods. And the virtue is a property or habit that is necessary to attain these goods. So a lot of religious systems, I was thinking especially of so-called religions of the sick soul. They work on similar lines. We have world as it is. In the Bible, for example, Israel is enslaved in Egypt. In Buddhism, suffering is due to clinging to life and the impermanence of it. Then there's the kind of telos, or kind of achieving the goal. Israel gets to the promised land, or a person gets to the nirvana. And then there's also salvation is a way of reaching the world telos, just like virtues are a way of reaching a person's good action or good life. In the Exodus story, it's God's grace, and in Buddhism, it is the Noble Eightfold Path. And things are called noble, good, and omnipotent if they save. The Eightfold Path is noble because it leads to nirvana, and God is good and omnipotent because he defeats the Pharaoh and guarantees salvation. And the whole problem about this kind of problem of evil and the kind of McIntyre talked a lot that modern moral philosophy can't work because it tries to kind of derive moral views of how man is, and maybe there's some kind of analogical thing going on with this kind of model, with this kind of Enlightenment natural theologies too. But I guess that I am now out of time, so I am asking you, Professor Wiertz, to comment on my work. Thank you.
Dear Kustos, dear Mr. Snellman, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to act as Mr. Snellman's opponent today, and let me thank you very much for the invitation. Laurie Snellman's dissertation deals with the philosophical discussion of the problem of evil. It's a perennial problem in philosophy of religion and theology. Even the Scottish 18th century philosopher David Hume referred to it as Epicurus' old questions. In its classical form, the problem of evil concerns the consistency of a set of sentences. That is, it concerns the question whether all these sentences can be true. The sentences in question are: God is omnipotent, God is omniscient, God is perfectly good, and evil exists. It seems that if God possesses these properties, there cannot be evil. But the existence of evil in the world is as plain as a pikestaff. Therefore, so the conclusion, God doesn't possess all of these properties. And because they are all essential for being God, there is no God. In response to this argument, theodicies have been developed. That is, it attempts to show that these four sentences, or to put it more simple, that the two sentences, evil exists and God exists, can both be true. Most theodicies attempt to formulate possible or actual reasons that could justify God to allow evil. These attempts presuppose that God needs sufficient reasons for allowing evil if God's divinity shall not be threatened by the existence of evil. But such attempts are not greeted with much enthusiasm in many camps of contemporary philosophy and theology, and that is putting it mildly. The problems of critics with theodicies is not that some theodicistic arguments are poor, but that the whole project is doomed to failure from the outset. Such a critique is called anti-theodicy. It castigates theodicies for the assumption that the existence of God, or the meaningfulness of the world, presuppose that all evils in the world have a sufficient reason and therefore have a purpose. the debate around the problem of evil and about the legitimacy of theodicies and the strength of the anti-theodicistic critique is a thriving part of contemporary English-speaking philosophy of religion. On the other hand, a mounting sense of frustration has become discernible because the debate seems to become petrified, characterized by backsliding, repetition, and obfuscation, as a commentator has put it recently. These remarks suffice to show that Snellman's dissertation deals with an important and timely topic, and that his courage to choose new ways of dealing with the problem of evil is to be welcomed. Snellman takes anti-theodicism's part and does it in a very sophisticated and original way. As he has convincingly argued that moral anti-theodicies, which point to various morally dubious aspects of theodicies, don't hold water, he pursues another anti-theodicist path, which is called conceptual anti-theodicy. He identifies the presuppositions of the problem of evil, shows that the conceptual basis of the argument from evil and theodicistic responses is confused, and that the relationship between ethics, metaphysics, and religion, which underlies the whole discussion, must be viewed in a new way. This way of proceeding and its breadth testify to Snellman's characteristic inclination and competence to dig deeper than usual in the philosophical discussion of evil and to bring together philosophical areas which seem to lie wide apart. To arrive at his aim, Snellman develops a method of philosophical grammar for examining the relevant presuppositions of theodicism, which are essentially grounded in a dualistic metaphysics, which separates value and meaning from facts and detaches such central concepts like God from the natural setting. The so-called principle of sufficient reason plays an important role in his approach, not only because this principle is responsible for the gap between facts and meaning, but also because theodicies are looking for sufficient reasons for the existence of evil. As far as I know, this role of the principle hasn't been explored systematically yet. Susan Nyman has done some historical work, but not much work in systematic terms. Snellman distinguishes and analyzes different versions of this principle and tries to show that the version that is presupposed by theodicism, namely that being is identical with reason, is false. As a consequence of this kind of metaphysical setting, central concepts of the discussion are confused. For example, the concepts of omnipotence and divine moral goodness. This way of exposing the errors of theodicism is based on a further development and clarification of the Wittgensteinian concept of language games with the help of technical tools like game theory, model theory, and category theory. In contrast to many Wittgensteinians, he views language games as the locus of intelligibility and sees them as the interface of language with reality. In this way, the rules of language games, which define the possibilities of what we can say and what not, ground our category system and thereby reveal the essence of the objects we talk about. Although neither the examination of the philosophical grammar of the basic concepts of the theodicy discourse, nor the use of the concept of language games in philosophy of religion is completely new, Snellman's dissertation breaks new ground even in methodological aspects. It's a highly original contribution because his way of developing the method of philosophical grammar and his original reconstruction of the concept of language games as ontological categories avoid the typical pitfalls of the use of the concepts of language game and philosophical grammar, namely non-cognitivism, anti-realism, and rampant relativism. Finally, the use of the methods and insights of game theory and category theory in connection with his method of philosophical grammar allows him to formulate a consistency proof that there is no contradiction in claiming that God does exist and evil does exist. and this without any reference to the principle of sufficient reason. Because first, God's goodness is to be understood as a commitment to defeat evil and heal all afflictions, and God's omnipotence means being able to defeat evil and heal all afflictions. And second, even in those games where evil exists, God wins the game when the world is repaired, and God has a successful winning strategy for the game. The existence of even horrendous evil is compatible with the existence of an omnipotent and perfectly good God, because the existence of evil is compatible with God committed to healing the world and God having a winning strategy to defeat evil. A methodological characteristic of this dissertation is the masterful combination of conceptual analysis and the approach of a descriptive metaphysics. Highly technical methods like game theory and also hermeneutical and historical approaches. So a major source of inspiration is the 18th century German philosopher Johann Georg Hamann, called Magus of the North, which points at the dark and personal style of his thinking and writing. Despite these hermeneutical difficulties, Laurie Snellman managed to bring out the insights of Hamann, especially his critique of various dichotomies, and use it for the benefit of furthering contemporary philosophical discussions. Behind all that stands his conviction that the problem of evil is not primarily a logical or epistemological theological problem, but a general problem with an important existential aspect, which all humans have to face, whether they believe in some deity or not, namely that evil seems to threat the intelligibility and meaningfulness of the world and the possibility to act morally. And these both are based on an overarching, meaningful word order, which is called in question by the existence of pointless evil. So, dear Mr. Snellman, thank you very much for this inspiring dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Wiertz. So, yes, yes.
Thank you, Oliver, so much. You can now start the actual discussion.
Okay, thank you. Again, let me thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to read a really excellent dissertation, which has inspired and is still inspiring my philosophical thoughts on the problem of evil. In the following, I will put some questions and critical remarks on the table, which are often more questions in nature than thorough criticism. I will pose some questions concerning important keywords in your dissertation, Laurie. I will lay out my own musings concerning these keywords to give you the background of my thinking and then ask you one or two questions. At the end of my part in the Defensio, I will ask you some small questions concerning particular passages in your dissertation and then conclude with some summarizing remarks. But as a German scholar, I'm surely expected to ask at least one or two historical questions. Because I won't disappoint this expectation, I will start with a short excursion into the field of history, of philosophy, and of ideas. My first remark concerns a minor point. The second marks the change to more systematic questions. The first question concerns your interpretation of Leibniz. I'm not sure that's very helpful to draw close parallels between Leibniz's theodicy and contemporary analytic discussion of the problem of evil, as you seem to do, or at least implicitly assume when you write that the contemporary discussion is based on neo-Leibniz theodicism, page 53 and more. Assuming such a parallel seems to overlook the deep differences of the respective contexts, and therefore the different aims of both discussions. Contemporary theodicists argue against the atheistic agnostic argument from evil. They want to show that it's logical and or epistemically possible to assert both sentences There are evils in the world, and there's the theistic God. This attempt is a reaction to the thesis that the existence of evil shows that God doesn't exist, or at least probably doesn't exist. So the subject is the existence, the justification of the belief in the existence of the theistic God. Leibniz mainly argued against Pierre Bayle's fideistic stance, which is the background of Bayle's thesis that Manichaeism is the more rational response to the fact that there are evils in the world. Bayle aims not at the castigation of Orthodox Christianity, at least in one possible interpretation, which seems plausible to me, but he aims at the castigation of the prevailing theological rationalism. The problem Bayle dwells on and Leibniz mainly struggles with is the so-called holiness problem, which centers around the involvement of God as creator and sustainer of every contingent being in moral evil. That's the center of Leibniz's discussion and not an argument against the existence of the theistic God. And therefore you can find these long, sometimes a little bit boring passages on the doctrine of grace, damnation, and so on in Leibniz's theodicy. And therefore Leibniz could assume the existence of God because this wasn't called into question. And infer from that deductively that our world must be the best of all possible worlds, which in fact may be Leibniz's lapse, but that's another question. And by the way, Leibniz didn't claim to know God's plans, but he explicitly states that we don't have any access to God's plan due to our finitude. So I have two questions. Which role does Leibniz play in your argument? And second, if it's vital for your argument, how would you answer the reproach of an unhistorical approach in the case of Leibniz?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second question properly.
Oh, sorry.
The audience.
The second question is, in case that Leibniz plays an important role in your argument, how would you answer the reproach of an unhistorical approach in the case of Leibniz? That's my, in a way, suspicion that you don't pay enough attention to the historical context of Leibniz.
Well, my reading of Leibniz, well, I have to say two things. The first is I'd say is the bigger problem. I only read the origin of the world, not theodicy. I read text on the ultimate origins of the world and I didn't and the monadology, but I didn't read his theodicy too. And the second one is that I am getting most of this kind of historical background and also these connections from Neumann.
Yes, yes.
She actually said that the contemporary discussion works on Leibniz and Hume, and I just don't know if kind of Leibniz was already a kind of classical Enlightenment thinker in the sense that he worked with this form of problem of evil that kind of say Plantinga and Mackey and Rao kind of work with, and it could be that I kind of constructed a 20th or 21st century Leibniz by taking first taking Nagel's Cartesian theism as a background and then kind of drawing analogies between the world text and contemporary theodicies, which are quite strong, and then kind of use Neumann as a kind of background all the time. So I didn't work Leibniz first. I didn't work Leibniz first from an history of ideas point of view. And I think that this is a kind of valid objection kind of in a history of ideas sense, but kind of I'm just trying to kind of sketch out a systematic position that kind of the whole kind of the debate kind of revolves around, and it could be a straw man if applied to historical Leibniz, but kind of my interest is more kind of systematic, kind of exposing the whole kind of debate that it has been going on for 300 years, and it hasn't gone anywhere, and it won't.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a strong, but that's the mainstream reading of Leibniz in contemporary philosophy of religion. As you have mentioned, Neiman, that brings me to my next more or less historical, it's a historical question. As many others, you talk about the crisis of theodicism in the aftermath of the catastrophe of Lisbon in 1755. You write that Lisbon was an anomaly for early modern theism, page 46, and in my words, shattered the ways of making sense of the world and acting in it by undermining their moral sources and conceptual resources. My impression is that you draw heavily on Neiman in this respect. And it's kind of conventional wisdom that Lisbon played this role. But I'm a little bit skeptical about the dramatic nature, at least of the immediate intellectual consequence of Lisbon. Take, for example, Kant's pre-critical writings, in which, and to quote Divistös and Billström's resume, Kant seems to have favored a basically Leibnizian theodicy. Let me only mention his essays on the earthquake of Lisbon from the beginning of 1756, in which he explains the natural disaster with the help of geological facts, and especially an attempt at some reflections on optimism, Versuch einiger Betrachtung über den Optimismus from 1759. By the way, the year in which Kant's contact with Hamann began, as far as I know. But at the end of this text from 1759, Kant writes that God has chosen us to play an important role in God's plans. And in an unusual emotional outburst, Kant pronounces to all human beings that they are blessed to exist and that God takes pleasure in us. It's right that the later Kant regretted the publication of this text and wanted it to be destroyed, but nevertheless, Kant has written such sentences nearly 4 years after Lisbon and in the publication year of Voltaire's Candide. Let me also mention Father Malagrida, a Jesuit who lived in Lisbon and immediately after the catastrophe called for repentance and fasting. And this was the motive of many sermons in the churches. The earthquake is not only God's punishment of sinful Lisbon, but a warning for all humans and an exhortation to convert to God's ways. In this way, Malagrida and the other preachers detected a religious meaning in the natural disaster, and many seem to have followed his lead. An interesting musical expression of the finally unshattered belief in God's might, lordship, and providence is Georg Philipp Telemann's Donnerode, Thunder Ode, whose first part was performed in 1756 and was inspired by the Lisbon earthquake. But interestingly, Telemann's work is an ode, not a lamentation, and in fact, it doesn't contain any sentiments of lament, bitterness, and so on. In this work, Telemann combines the operatic musical description of the forces of nature with a rejoicing praise of God's majesty and power in the form of a large hymn of praise. God is the only Lord of nature, and during his lifetime, during Telemann's lifetime, the Thunder Ode was one of his most performed works. And it was interestingly performed in the end of 1757 as a prelude to the Te Deum, to this very festive hymn. And like the Te Deum, it's a hymn of praise which magnifies the Almighty, his Lord's greatness and majesty and his power aboard all natural forces. Accordingly, the music is very festive and so on. This points, and the first part begins with a captivating chorus on the first, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth." That's the beginning of Psalm 8. This points to the fact that alongside theologians and philosophers who began to doubt God's justice and omnipotence in the aftermath of the Lisbon disaster, and there are many of these, there were others who saw that catastrophe of Lisbon as an affirmation of God's justice and power. part of a greater plan in which humankind was a player besides others. And this sentiment is also mirrored in Kants Versuch einiger Betrachtungen über den Optimismus. Voltaire's cynical or ironical reaction in Candide was not the only kind of reaction, and perhaps not even the prevalent one. So, I would claim that in spite of a widespread assumption, the earthquake doesn't make an end to traditional theodicies and doctrines of providence, at least not immediately. It doesn't make impossible to tell a coherent story about God's providence and his omnipotence, about his justice and moral perfection. And now to move in direction of the more systematic questions. Does the earthquake make theodicies intellectually disreputable? Is it after Lisbon, not to mention Auschwitz, impossible to offer theodicies in an intellectually honest way? Kant doesn't think that's possible, but what are the reasons for that and what could be possible reasons? I don't ask for the moral judgments on theodicies because I totally agree with the opposition that moral anti-theodicy is based on the success of conceptual anti-theodicy. So why should it be impossible after Lisbon to give theodicies and to remain intellectually honest? Why does a theodicist lose his or her sincerity when she or he offers a theodicy? So when you hear in the background the critical hint at Kant's verdict on Job's friends and Sami's verdict too, you are on the right path. I cannot see many good reasons for such a categorical verdict. Could you please help me to understand this better?
Well, I think that it is possible to be intellectually honest and give theodicies after Lisbon or Auschwitz or whatever. And we have a whole cottage industry of Plantinga and Rau and people like and say today Van Inwegen and people like that doing it. So it is certainly possible to do it in an intellectually honest way. And my kind of, again, here I am commenting on Neumann and I'm presupposing that her reading of this intellectual history is correct. But again, the kind of picture is more nuanced than what she gives, because she gives them kind of an, in a way, even a kind of weak history of the problem of the debate on evil. In a way, it is a kind of a teleological history and it is a very typical Enlightenment history in terms that you move on from kind of this kind of very simplistic views of saying that God has a straightforward reason, as in Lisbon, or that human activity and human actions can explain evil in some morally significant way, as in the 20th century disaster. And then she kind of moves on to kind of how the kind of discussion in a way breaks down, and it kind of breaks down in that it in a way becomes very fragmented in my mind, and that you cannot clearly kind of see any kind of direct links leading either to kind of providentialism or humanism or atheism or nihilism or whatever, but you have to have some kind of meta-philosophical point of view in the view of sufficient reasons and how reason and morality relate and so on. So I am basically here dependent on Neumann. And she has her own agenda. And it kind of looks that it was kind of simplistic and to say that Lisbon stopped theodicies or that the 20th century wars and dictatorships killed off the faith in progress. Of course, we have Fukuyama in our time. That's a kind of analogy here. So I'd say that Neumann has certainly her own agenda, and I'm just following her description. But it's I think that you are correct that it is maybe dangerous if you view her as a weak historian, and which she seems to be.
Thank you very much. Now I come to these important keywords in your dissertation. I skipped the keyword of metaphysical realism. That's a too huge topic, as so many others. But let me ask some questions concerning your use of the concept of language game. This notion plays an important role in your thesis. But with the use of this concept, you have burdened a heavy load of theoretical commitments and especially of possible misunderstandings and so on. I think you are aware of this. So my first question concerning language games, what is the advantage of talking about language games over the simple statement that in many cases, the meaning of a word is determined by its use, including its inferential relations to other word statements, and therefore by the commitments, endorsing or rejecting other statements by a certain amount, and so on. So why don't draw on random on so?
Well, I guess that it's my background here. I have a background in, say, Hamann, Peirce. Peirce already developed this idea of a formal language game as a logician. Then in Hintikka too, and also in Wittgenstein, and also in Baker and Hacker, although I don't agree with the main thesis that there's a strong language word dualism in Wittgenstein. So this it's the kind of background where I come from, is some kind of, say, in a way, pragmatism somehow that has both strong kind of very, very strong both lived reality aspects and very strong logicistic aspects. Different thinkers kind of emphasize them very differently. Say, for example, Hamann emphasizes lived reality very strongly, as does James. Hintikka is extremely logicistic, and I criticize him for it in this book. And Peirce kind of tries to hold these two ways of looking at things together, but I'd say he kind of tilts to the logicistic side, maybe. And my this kind of semi-theoretical, or this kind of theoretical approach, maybe it kind of comes even from Baker and Hacker, who have this kind of long commentary on language games and all their aspects in the commentary on Wittgenstein. And there's also this kind of big question that how do you kind of try to systematize very anti-systematic thinkers who like Wittgenstein or Hamann. So I'd say that it comes in a way from my theoretical background, and there's also the kind of point that you can always kind of develop kind of partial descriptions or some kind of sketches that can be always improved on and can be selectively applied to certain kind of cases, just like scientific paradigms, for example, and so on. So I'm not kind of claiming completeness. And there's also always this great quote from Eisenhower, which I really love, that plans are useless, but planning is extremely important. It's complete. You can't do without it. And I think that the same kind of approach works well with theories. So it's basically kind of the kind of sources I write, sources I use, that I use, for example, Peirce instead of Brandon, and say I use Wittgenstein instead of say Habermas or something like that. And there are many kind of approaches to this kind of, and I'd say that I have some kind of systematic kind of interest in trying to chart this concept of language game and kind of trying to kind of highlight these language games as Lichtung or language games as a locus of intelligibility aspect. And I guess that this kind of drives a lot of my interest too.
Mm. Now, if you talk about religion as language game, then certain questions follow. The first is, do we have different religious language games according to the different religions, or do we have one religious language game? At page 304, you seem to presuppose that there are different religious language games. But then, but besides that, the question arises, which identity criteria for the religious language game or for a religious language game we do have? In my opinion, the criterion of a certain vocabulary will not do, because surely the exclamation "Good God" or the Bavarian crucifix are not per se part of a religious language game, just the contrary in the last one. You may reply that's a question of the right kind of speech acts. But what distinguishes religious speech acts from other kind of speech acts? I fear that in answering these questions, you cannot avoid dealing with the vexed question of the nature of religion, or call it the definition of the concept of religion, or to put it more general, you have to deal with the question, what makes a religion, and what distinguishes a religion from a non-religious worldview, and what distinguishes one religion from another religion. And I'm not sure that such large units like religion or science or metaphysics, perhaps they are simply too abstract and too big to count as language games. So what would you say concerning these questions?
Well, I'd agree with that, because I'd agree that even within a single religious tradition, there are many kinds of language games, games for praying, games for having worship events, games for, say, for example, games for example in Christianity, baptisms, things like that, burials, prayers, and it's really a question about the nature or definition of religion. I was taking a working definition from Ninian Smart and William James, and their kind of definitions have a methodological weakness, that is that they are extremely individualist.
Yes.
But I'm still working with them, and I think that in sciences, well, at least you have every paradigm, which is a network of language games. You have ways of making measurements, you have ways of making predictions, making inferences, holding doctoral thesis defenses, and so on. So I think that I am in a way pluralist, pretty much in a Wittgensteinian sense, that there's a whole list of these different language games, and you just can't kind of lump areas of practice like science and areas of practice like religion, and these always lead to kind of definitional questions. That in science there has been this great quest for a scientific method and for a demarcation problem that really, it seems to me, confused, and also the whole definition of religion has been criticized because it, as for example, as Eurocentric, that it kind of imposed post-Reformation definitions of religion on earlier societies that didn't, for example, separate religion and politics, or didn't work with a disenchanted view of a world, or where religion wasn't just a specific area of life, and so on. So these are kind of, I'd say that these kind of questions are inherently very problematic.
Yeah, it's a very vexed question and very difficult. Next point, but I'm not sure that I've understood you right. In general, I'm skeptical about the strict separation between different language games. Dewey Phillips has sometimes remarked that he doesn't see the religious language game as entirely cut off from other language games. But in fact, he seems to presuppose a complete autonomy when insisting that religious beliefs are not to be judged on the basis of criteria from non-religious language games. And what's really important is that your Harmanian account of religion may be understood similarly, drawing heavily on oppositions between revelation faith on the one side and metaphysics and philosophical theology on the other side. But such a position strikes me as problematic. Why? Concerning first the general question of the relation between language games, we all play more than one language game and therefore have to detect or create connections between our language games if we don't want to suffer from intellectual and or linguistic schizophrenia. Take, for example, Christianity. It's a worldview, as you would agree. And worldviews are cosmic outlooks. They offer an understanding of the world and one's place within it that forms the background to our thoughts, feelings, and actions. But it's important for worldview to be coherent and to be comprehensive, because without that, it cannot give us orientation. So we have to, in a way, detect relations or create relations between different language games, which doesn't mean to neglect the differences, but there's no use in separating them very sharply. And for example, your position on the role of metaphysics in religion, that seems to be really Wittgensteinian, and you seem to follow him in using the concept of language game to expel from metaphysics, in assuming that there is a kind of natural language free of metaphysics. This strikes me as rather implausible. Take such an ordinary sentence like, "I love you as much or perhaps deeper than on the first day of our marriage," said to one's wife or husband. This sentence is full of metaphysical implications and assumptions. That persons are stable entities, that my wife or husband is in a relevant sense the same as many years ago, that I am the same in a relevant sense, and so on, that we are really married. I would agree that such common metaphysical assumptions of daily life are the material for metaphysical reflection. And that's the connection between metaphysics and our daily life and our life world. But I can see no sense in using a natural language free of metaphysics as definitive criterion for metaphysical reflection. That also goes goes to von Frasen's critique of analytic metaphysics, which we refer to. I'm not really convinced that he's very successful. And concerning the relation between the religion and metaphysics, I don't see any problem in principle. Surely there are metaphysical reformulations of religious language which are deficient. But what's the reason for that? The reasons are mainly philosophical in nature, and the main problem is not that they do not justice to the religious practice, but they are bad philosophy or bad metaphysics. And even if they differ from certain religious practices or usages, the question is still open whether that's a fault of metaphysics or of certain religious practices, which are confused or just superstitious. So, put a complex question short, I think that a strict separation of language games is unwarranted. And I think that goes also for the case of the relation between metaphysics and between religions. And if you take, for example, the certain religious tradition, namely that in the Roman Catholic Church, it's very important it's a very important characteristic of this tradition in its intellectual respects that there is a very deep relation between philosophy, theology, reason, and faith, and that metaphysics plays an important role. And popes as John Paul II or Benedict XVI have stressed on this. I don't want to say that they are right, but interestingly, there are religious language games or religious traditions which have as part of their own tradition a strong stress on interconnectedness of faith and reason and of theology and metaphysical, philosophical theology, and which try to save an important place for metaphysical reflections in their conception of religion. So I'm not really convinced that metaphysics is so inimical to religion, as I guess Harman thinks.
Well, thank you for this critique. I guess that here are a lot of kind of different issues. Well, one was which I heard it could be that I'm hearing stuff between the lines, but the first one is Wittgensteinian fideism. And I just, or something like that, that there's some kind of, in Wittgensteinian fideism, there's a strong distinction between religious language and actual language. And here there's a strong distinction between Wittgensteinian language and not Wittgensteinian language, but with religious language and metaphysical language. And then there's also kind of, well, that is a kind of the kind of first question I am kind of, and then the second one is kind of the relationship between faith and the reason. I guess that these are kind of, I hope that, let's put it this way, that I hope that I didn't kind of come out as a kind of a Wittgensteinian fideist, because I don't kind of sympathize with this kind of, and if asked about the kind of relationship between faith and the reason, faith and metaphysics, and faith and reason and metaphysics, I was thinking that more on the lines of partially overlapping magisteria, and I have a kind of research application into the Finnish Kone Foundation on this issue, but the kind of, well, I'd say that I'd like to kind of follow some kind of partially overlapping magisteria view, and I think that I might have the resources to do that. I'd like to write more about this, the way kind of different kind of language games are, not language games, but worldviews are kind of grand strategies for making sense, and they can kind of borrow from each other. A certain worldview can borrow from different language games, as in metaphysics and so on. But I think that my own background is more in line with Strawson's kind of descriptive metaphysics. And I also kind of claim that kind of philosophical description is always loaded with hermeneutical theory and also with philosophical theory. So, and I also talked about language games as categories. So I guess that my main debt to the Wittgensteinian tradition is the idea that metaphysical description and other types of philosophical descriptions are kind of second order activity. And for example, in Catholic theology can easily kind of use kind of, say, Aristotelianism or Aquinas. I actually use the Thomistic tradition a lot when I'm talking about the nature of causation and stuff like that. But this kind of, I'd say that kind of works as a kind of articulation of religious belief at a kind of doctrinal level or theological grammar. And I think that it is completely legitimate to use, say, for example, Aristotle there.
Mm.
When you are provided that you are aware of what you are doing, and you just kind of articulate how you are using Aristotle, and how this is kind of faithful to the faith tradition that you are trying to axiomatize. Because I am one of my kind of suspicions about the problem of evil is that it became so big because they were using first Aristotelianism as a kind of meta theory for Christianity in the Middle Ages, and then they switched over to the mechanistic or Epicurean worldview in the scientific revolution, but they still kept the old proofs of God, and they kept this kind of old view of the virtues and stuff like that, and then they just kind of lacked the kind of conceptual machinery to justify their claims. So I think that you can do theology, say, with Aristotle, and you can also kind of things like that, and then you can also use these kind of grammars as a kind of articulation of rules for language games. So I think that this kind of language games as categories, language games as kind of and rules as a kind of norms, and theology as a kind of grammar for language, and the kind of theory ladenness of grammar, and also theory ladenness of doctrine as a grammar of religious faith. In a way, I'd say that I can answer these kind of objections that I have introduced Wittgensteinian fideism from the back door. I feel that now that thinking about it, I'd say that I can manage to avoid that.
Mm. As I've understood your dissertation right, and your remarks now, I have the impression that in your eyes, the principle of sufficient reason is one of the villains in this story of theodicism. And surely I appreciate your analysis of the principle of sufficient reason, which distinguishes between different versions. But unfortunately, I'm not always sure which version you mean when you critically refer to the role of this principle. And surely the causal version, ex nihilo nihil fit, nothing comes from nothing, has a strong intuitive appeal. It's a principle deeply entrenched in our daily life, and also this causal principle seems to be deeply ingrained in our in Christian and Jewish and I think Islamic thinking and practices. According to the traditions, God is the creator of heaven and earth. God has created everything ex nihilo, even, and so on and so on. And then take also the doctrine of divine providence, and don't motivate all these things a certain reconstruction of the principle of sufficient reason in theological terms, so that this principle, at least in some of its versions, is not only very intuitive, but it's also in a way an abstract and metaphysical way of formulating different insights and central tenets of faith traditions. And if you accept this, that everything which exists has its source in God, nothing exists without God's approval or against God's will, and that God's providential care is over everything and so on, don't lead these beliefs to perplexity about the state of the world and lead to ask for an explanation. And that's a theological answer to the that asking for a theological answer to the question why the world is the kind of place it is. So I would say we get a theological problem of evil without any hypertrophic metaphysical speculations or without any enlightenment metaphysics, and especially without any hypertrophic principle of sufficient reason. Take Richard Swinburne, a theodicist, if there's any at all, but he repudiates the principle of sufficient reason. And but surely he sees a problem of evil. He also repudiates the claim that everything which has a full explanation has an ultimate explanation. So he wouldn't equate being with in reason. But he sees a problem of reason, and I think we can reconstruct the philosophical problem of reason or the argument field as a deeply theological and religiously motivated question. So it's not too much good in criticizing different versions of the principle of sufficient reason and then assuming that thereby I have criticized the whole theodicism project.
Thanks for this comment. I was thinking that the kind of point here is that kind of the principles of sufficient reason can be used as principles of order in theology, and I agree that they are, and they are quite often used in, for example, arguments for God's existence. And it can be that I was again kind of referring to this kind of general argument that I kind of got from Neumann, and I also was referring to this kind of theodicists like Plantinga and Rao and Mackey, who are kind of my main targets here. And I also kind of argue that you can use it as a kind of a meta theory for Christianity or other faiths too, but you have to be careful about it. I guess that if we are kind of doing a kind of description of, say, Catholicism that borrows very heavily from Aristotelianism, then you have to kind of argue that some versions of the principle of sufficient reason are also parts of a description of this faith tradition, say, but these are also kind of that there's also a lot of framework there that gives them kind of meaning or gives them kind of significance, both from a kind of theoretical and religious points of view too. For example, Aristotle's doctrine of four causes already gives a very kind of strong view of causation that kind of, in a way, gives kind of ways of pointing out all these kinds of sufficient reasons and so on. And then there's also this kind of idea that the kind of principle of sufficient reason is kind of used as a principle of order that is used to articulate and to systematize creation theology.
Yes.
So I was then again kind of thinking on the line that then it kind of goes into this kind of, then it kind of works as a kind of meta principle for systematizing creation theology and pointing out God-world links, for example, with these kind of proofs of God, for example. So I'd say that this can be done, but it also kind of presupposes a kind of very strong, more of a background. And there's also a question of, say, if we're talking about Catholicism, then there's also a question about the interpretation of Aquinas, for example, that in what sense he is an evidentialist or a foundationalist, because there are people who read him and his Aristotelian PSR-based proofs of God as kind of partially overlapping magisterial ideas about the best science of that day, that is Aristotelianism and religion of his day. And if you are doing that, then that is, I'd say that that is legitimate, as long as you just kind of say very clearly what you are doing with these principles of sufficient reason, and take enough care that you do not end up in any kind of contradictions or stuff like that. And if you are doing this kind of stuff, then I'd say that, I'm sorry, I just can't help of thinking of technical logic, and I was thinking of Russell's paradox and the action of comprehension in set theory, but something similar has to be done in order to kind of avoid the contradiction with kind of by limiting these principles. Of course, it goes on in set theory. You have it in Kant to kind of limiting the scope of principles or of metaphysics in order to kind of avoid antinomies. And well, I'd say that it can be done. And if you are doing a descriptive metaphysics of, say, the Catholic Christian religion, then obviously you have to say that that principle of sufficient reason in certain limited forms and in a certain limited backgrounds is an important part of that. And also the kind of traditional versions of the cosmological proofs. That is also, but you have to have some kind of creation theology and some kind of religious practice in the background that you are trying to systematize. And you have to be very careful that you don't end up in antinomies or stuff like that.
Yes, thanks. Concerning contradictions, I think that's a good point to talk about the concept of omnipotence. That is in your dissertation, pages 308 and following. You quote approvingly, as it seems, Phillips, that the grammatical possibilities of omnipotence, which are revealed in religious language games, offer a different picture of omnipotence than the logical picture. And these grammatical possibilities revealed in religious language make it clear that God cannot ride a bicycle, for example. Allow me 2 remarks. For this insight of Phillips that God cannot ride a bicycle, I don't need a religious language game, but only an adequate definition of omnipotence. In other words, the problem is not the metaphysical context of the discussion of omnipotence, but the missing attention to the metaphysical context of the talk about divine omnipotence. That is, the inadequate attention to the other metaphysical properties of God, such as immateriality, perfect goodness, and so on. And that is the problem of these poor definitions are not too much metaphysics, but too less or too bad metaphysics. And that metaphysics is now, the lane is shown by the fact that Phillips, on whom you rely, doesn't deal with all possible conceptions of omnipotence. Phillips' favorite conception of omnipotence, namely God is omnipotent, if and only if for any logical possible state of affairs, such that the statement that God brings about that state of affairs is coherent. God can bring about that state of affairs, has its own pitfalls, as it cannot exclude such cases as that of this famous or infamous MacEar, that is an omnipotent being who is omnipotent because he can scratch his left ear and who is essentially only capable of performing this one type of action. And that contradicts our intuitive understanding of omnipotence. I would propose another little bit more complex formulation of omnipotence, but that's not the place to dwell on it. I would say that on the one hand, such definitions that I would propose are certainly part of metaphysical philosophical theology. On the other hand, it seems to have some advantages over Dewey Phillips' own formulation. So that's the first yes, the concept of omnipotence has some difficulties, but that's not the problem of the metaphysical discussion of it, but that different metaphysical discussions of this concept are failing, but that's not a problem of metaphysics in general. And second, or perhaps comment on this, please.
About the concept of omnipotence, well,
yes, please.
I guess that again, this kind of, I'd say that this kind of question again kind of revolves around that, around the kind of fact that I am presenting objections to this kind of, say, standard theodicies in late 20th century analytic philosophy of religion. And I was just, there it is kind of pretty much presupposed that they are working with a pretty kind of simple definition of omnipotence, and what kind of Phillips is objecting to is the view that you can have, for example, logical space again for free, and you can first define a logical space and then kind of define God's actions against its background, but you first have to have some kind of background for logical spaces in the first hand. And when we are doing philosophy of religion, or when we are describing religious practices, or describing religious doctrines and so on, you have to kind of rely on the kind of background alternative space that is already given by this kind of religious context. And I think that again, this is not so much the kind of idea that you can't use kind of, you can't say that that omnipotence is a choice over some, but I'd say that you have to kind of have the religious context already fixed. And I guess that this is the key for kind of Phillips's arguments.
Okay, I'm skeptical that you need religious context. In fact, that's the background of most discussions in medieval times and also in modernity. But I think that's a question of origin, but not of logical relations. But be that as it may, I also don't think that you need the concept of omnipotence to get a theological problem of evil. The concept of almightiness is enough. Peter Geach has written all these things. But I would skip all that to come at last question, and it's not my job, to your consistency proof. One of the important parts of your work. I'm not sure, and if I remember correctly, perhaps Michael has the other commentator has referred to it. I'm not sure. If not in your consistency proof, a problem arises which is at least analogous to the problem of the interpretation of the fall as origin and therefore explanation of the existence of all natural and moral evils in the world. What do I mean by this perhaps cryptic remark? The problem of the use of the story of the fall as such an explanation for the existence of evil consists in arising the questions why God, almighty and omniscient creator and sustainer of all that is, creates a world with such creatures as the snake and a world with such feeble creatures as Adam and Eve. What does it mean that God saw all that he had made and it was very good, Genesis first chapter. And then what's the place of the snake and of Adam and Eve in such a very good word? Or put it differently, how's the fall with its dreadful consequences possible in a very good word? In the case of your consistency proof, the question arises why God plays this sort of game at all. Why does God play the justice of God game with the terrible suffering at all? That is, granted that God wins the game and perhaps knows from the outset that he's winning the game. Why does he start it at all? Why doesn't God choose to play some other game? That's a perplexing question. And a new problem of evil arises, and this problem calls for an answer. I don't see many possibilities to give an answer in favor of Christianity besides the answers of a higher order goods defense, or besides the denial of an answer in the spirit of skeptical theism. So you are back to classical positions of contemporary theodicism. So I would like, doesn't that mean that theodicy is back even in your consistency proof? Or to put it in the terminology of the biblical language game, why combating and defeating evil when not creating or admitting evil in the first place would save the creatures much suffering? And even if one grants that God really has a winning strategy, the question arises, okay, but why this game? But then another question follows. What does speak in favor of God having a winning strategy, or to put it more precisely, what does speak in favor of the assumption that God has a successful winning strategy? How can one justify this assumption? You could answer that's the meaning of omnipotence or of almightiness. But doesn't that just beg the question, as the atheological argument from evil exactly questions the combination of having a winning strategy and the theological understanding of the aim of God's winning strategy? To be more acute, I mean, reasons which could be accepted by doubting believers and open-minded and friendly atheists and agnostics can be given. Which reasons can that be? And well, so you, in my impression, theodicy, the theodicy problem is back, and you need some kind of theodicism.
Well, I just have to kind of answer this objection later, because it seems that it is kind of a big kind of issue here, and this kind of idea that okay, so now I have described this kind of language game, which is kind of offered as a kind of interpretation or description of this kind of the book of Job and the debate here. Of course, it's a very kind of partial, and it is in some ways it's an intermediate model or even a toy model, but the kind of idea where how do I kind of justify this kind of using this kind of model? Well, I was just kind of that it kind of captures the kind of structure, captures the kind of debate between God and Job in the book. So it's kind of an articulation why this game, why use this model rather than some other model with different kind of logical properties, is that I'm trying to capture a kind of specific debate. And then there's also this kind of second related question, that doesn't this kind of reduce the problem again into some kind of bring back kind of the kind of theodicy framework by presupposing some kind of meta level where God again is omnipotent and omniscient and benevolent in the traditional sense, where God first kind of selects which game to play, and then the whole thing goes as a sub game. I'll have to think about it, but I'd say that taking this kind of traditional theodicy as a kind of meta game kind of presupposes that you end up kind of offering the traditional traditional kind of model bringing back to the back door, then that then kind of offers a kind of different kinds of definitions and different kinds of views of God, the God-world relationship, and so on, rather than the ones I am trying to articulate with the model. And I'll have to simply think about it. And there's a lot of this that doesn't kind of, in a way that doesn't these kind of models, to what extent they are counter, that how do these kind of models relate to the old ways of phrasing the problem? I'd say that this is the kind of big question here, which I'd really like to think about more. But I think that if you kind of bring back the kind of old idea of, again, kind of turn it into a second, or in a way kind of second order kind of Leibnizian decision-making problem again, where God kind of chooses between different interactions in the traditional sense, then it will kind of, it's a game changer back in the direction of the traditional models, and that will obviously kind of change the situation so radically that there's that the kind of relationship described in that way is different. But I'll have to think more about it and maybe write a paper about it or something in the future.
Thank you. I'm expecting.
But the whole question is that how these kind of models you have, for example, in the book of Job, how do they kind of relate to the kind of traditional answers to the problem of evil? That here the question is that do they kind of presuppose it as a meta theory, which is what you and Ahti-Veikko Pietarinen have been proposing, while everybody who's commenting on the book of Job, it just kind of, they kind of say that it offers some kind of different view to the problem, a different take. And also that kind of, I found myself a book written by John Levenson, The Creation and the Persistence of Evil. He'd say that for example, this idea that God should not so much explain evil, but to blast it out. This is his way of phrasing my approach. Again, in the book of Job.
Yes.
He said that this actually challenges creation out of nothingness, the traditional idea, and it's a kind of big question. And I think that we are going quite deep into more into kind of theology, about different theological presuppositions of God and the world, and then kind of how these kind of different models, simply having this game model and defining the concepts internal to it, or introducing another model which kind of first has a decision problem of God choosing among different games in the traditional omnipotence model, and how this kind of relates. So it's more about question of theological hermeneutics and how they kind of interplay with these technical tools for articulating stuff. But I'd say that the question definitely goes back to kind of philosophy and biblical hermeneutics and stuff like that. Which kind of ways is the best, and then build a model and then use these kind of definitions for extracting stuff out of the model that kind of function as an articulation. So I'd say that it is biblical hermeneutics first, or doctrine first you have to do. But this is something that kind of needs more exploration.
Thank you very much. So far I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wiertz.
Excuse me, you mean you're done with the questions altogether?
Yes.
Okay, yes. Then we are ready to move on to your final statement, Oliver.
Yes, okay. So let me make that clear what every one of you knows, that disagreement is the lifeblood of philosophy, and in this respect, we had a lively philosophical exchange. And let me thank you again for that. But it's not disagreement simpliciter which characterize philosophy, but well-reasoned disagreement, and disagreement that is disagreement which is based on different assessments of conceptual links and different assessments of the strength of arguments. But it's a disagreement itself backed by reasons. And as many would agree, there seem to be pretty few knockdown arguments in philosophy, and therefore it doesn't come as a surprise that we haven't reached a final agreement and that we have to leave many questions open. But that's not the important point. Of utmost importance is the breadth of the discussion due to the breadth of Laurie Snellman's dissertation and the precise and well-argued answers to my questions, which reflect the high methodological level of the dissertation. And Laurie Snellman's dissertation has prompted a partly deep-going discussion, as also has given rise to two very interesting preliminary reports. And that shows its high quality. And therefore, I wholeheartedly propose to the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki that the dissertation be accepted. Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Wiertz.
It was a pleasure.
Onko vielä yleisöllä kysymyksiä? Questions from the audience, please.
No questions asked. I declare the defense closed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Looks